I literally pulled this car out of a field. The story behind it is that my dad's really into building hot rods and restoring muscle cars too. That's where I get it from. And he had bought this car for parts. He bought two. He has one that's in much better shape that he's gonna restore. Make it like a car that he had when he first got his license. The parts car that was left over, I was able to buy it off of him for about the same price that I sold my 240. Pretty good deal, right? Now why I chose an El Camino chassis? Like I said before, my dad had one when he first got his license. And when I was 13, the very first car that I got was a Chevy El Camino. It was the G-Body, the newer generation of this, but still made its place in my heart. It's a car that I've loved for my entire life, and I've dreamt of doing a build like this since I was probably 4 or 5 years old. That's why El Camino. And why make it a drift car with a C4 Corvette suspension? Story on the Corvette suspension was I initially bought it for my Acadian and then decided to go a different route with it. So I had the leftover parts that I once tried to sell, but they never sold, so I just figured I'd hang on to them in case a situation like this would arise. I like to think that I grew up at a really good time of the automotive evolution industry kind of deal. I'm old enough to understand, love, and appreciate the hot rodders, the old school muscle cars. I'm also young enough to have grown up during the evolution of the import craze, the start of drifting, and all the fun stuff like that. So why not combine all those worlds into one crazy beast of a car that's gonna look cool and be completely different? This is my Chevy El Camino drift build.
Fucking rules. Said it can't be done, but our time has come. We play with fire and burn.
So I took possession of the chassis, the El Camino, at about the end of July and started gathering all my parts. I went through in the back, and we live on a big farmland, so we got storage kind of like just scattered junkyard style. I had some stuff stashed out in the back.
Leftovers in this kind of junkyard deal thing. Might need some help to dig that out in my truck. It's over there. But everything will have its day.
Covered from the elements. Went there, started collecting all my parts, seeing what I had, and it turns out that over the years of playing with these cars and drifting and doing other motorsports and stuff like that, I always seem to hang on to bits and pieces of things. So now I pretty much have the complete setup I need. I've got motor, trans, wiring harness, ECU, some pretty wild stuff, some very high performance stuff. I'm gonna need to get a fuel cell and a couple lines and stuff like that, but the suspension that I had put on this thing has full brakes and everything. Good to go, ready to rock and roll. So it was just a question of gathering all the stuff and making a plan and getting to work.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Oh, crazy mother.
I got the El Camino in the shop and started cleaning it up, investigating further what I'm up against, and realized that there's really a lot of parts of this thing that are gonna have to be chopped off. The floors were pretty much finished, parts of the fenders, parts of the wheel wells, parts of the bed. Most of it's gotta go, and I'm building a race car, so it doesn't really matter how much of it goes. It's gotta go and make room for everything I have to put into it. The roll cage, the race seats, safety equipment, new motor, new trans. And I had a crazy plan of moving the engine back a couple inches to hopefully match the weight balance distribution geometry of the Corvette a little bit, since I'm running a C4 Corvette suspension. And that's aluminum A-arms up front, rack and pinion steering, much lighter than the stock stuff that was on this El Camino, which was pretty crazy. The steering box that had like 2.5 turns locked from center to lock. And the back end of this thing, I got rid of the straight differential and those drum brakes, all that heavy setup, and put in a full aluminum independent rear suspension, which is also from the C4 Corvette. can't be beat. Looks good. It should perform really well, and I just hope it balances itself out and everything works out to perform at its maximum potential. Now, step number one, I did the front suspension because I assumed that would be the hardest one to do, where I have to get all the geometry right. I have to get everything lined up properly, squared off, corner to corner, do all the good measurements. And I had to make the chassis I had to massage the metal a bit. The suspension, the whole subframe, everything fit in between the frame rails on the El Camino, but I had to chop the inside and bring it in about 1/2 inch on each side because the subframe of the Corvette actually has a bit of a taper on the pieces that hold your upper A-arms. To make it sit, to cradle it properly, I had to take a little bit off the bottom to make the car sit as low as I wanted it to sit, and on the outside, I had to eliminate the big cups that were in the frame that held the stock springs in place. Because the Corvette suspension is based on a graphite kind of fiberglass leaf spring, and it's got just shocks in it, no more big coil springs, so that had to be eliminated, make room for everything else. I had to make room for the A-arms to clear and make sure it all aligned. So that was the hardest part, I assumed. When the front was done, I got it to sit on the ground. I put some toe straps on it that would simulate the suspension sitting lower with the weight of the engine. It sits nice, it looks good, it tucks kind of how I want. And the best part of it is it's not too low that it should perform good. And if I do want to go lower, they sell drop spindles for that suspension, and I can go up to a 3-inch, or down to a 3-inch drop, which will be pretty significant, I think. Gonna have an issue maybe with the oil pan clearing later on. Now the front's all in, everything's dialed, I got to move on to the back. Now I assumed the back would be easy because I measured the Corvette suspension and its mounting points sit in between the frame rails. So I have nothing in the way, I thought. I made brackets, put it all in, made it fit. First time around, I actually had it too far back. I mismeasured on the inside of the fenders and on the frame where it would sit. I ended up with the back wheel sitting way too far back. It looked horrible, so I figured, okay, can't accept that, can't accept almost okay. It's gotta be to the way I envisioned it, the way I want it. So I chopped those off and moved it forward, got it to sit in the right place, welded the new brackets in, did all that fun stuff, got in the back of the truck, jumped on it, and realized that the frame, because it sits wider than the mounting points of the Corvette suspension, when the suspension compresses, the calipers and the mounts for the sway bars, everything runs directly into the stock frame of the El Camino, which gave me maybe 1.5 inches of travel, and that would just be disaster. So once again, can't accept subpar. It's got to be perfect to the way I want it, the way I envisioned it. My only solution around this now is to build my own section of frame. So I've never done a modification like this to a car, actually cutting the frame off and building my own pieces and putting it together as one whole piece together and making it function. But I am lucky enough to have witnessed my dad do it to Corvettes or other muscle cars that he was building, and I had a pretty good idea where to go. So I started getting to work, made a plan, measured 100 times, made sure everything was right. It was kind of tricky because I had to measure angles and heights and distances to make sure it all fit in. Fortunately enough, the way I built it, it sort of slid into the stock frame where I had cut the stock frame off, so everything was lining up nicely. They fit pretty good, but I've got to shorten this, I've got to get rid of these, I've got to clean everything up, make a good surface to weld to. I've got to cut these down a little bit. And the idea is, you can see here, this is the new piece of frame, comes down like this, it's going to go off that way, this one's going to go off that way. I had to weld that whole frame section in, get the diff to sit in there properly with all the mounts. The tricky part on this one was doing the ladder bars, because that was also another problem that I had on the stock frame, was the ladder bars lined up right inside the frame. So I would have to chop out way too much and sacrifice way too much strength to make that work properly. And on this one, the frame sits narrow enough that the ladder bars sit on the outside just like a Corvette does. And I made some plates and I designed it so that I could have some sort of measurement, so I could pull the front wheels in forward, or I can push them back a little bit by just using spacers, maybe some washers on the mounting points of the ladder bars themselves. The rear end was complete. The whole El Camino is back on the ground, a rolling chassis. I called the boys that came over and helped me put the motor and trans in to see where everything's gonna fit and where everything was gonna go. So we put the motor in, measured it up, figured out that we're gonna have to cut the firewall big time and the floors to get the transmission, everything to fit the way it should. The motor is gonna sit a little higher than stock in the stock chassis, but that gives me all kinds of clearance below so that I don't have to worry about the transmission hitting the drive shaft, dragging on the ground or anything like that. The drive shaft's actually gonna sit above the floor, which means I had to cut out pretty much the entire floor. Most of it was rotten, so no big deal. It was gonna have to go anyway, and I have to make new floors now or buy new ones. I'm gonna make my own floors so I can get it to sit as low as I can, because I'm a tall guy and I want a lot of headroom in there. I want space inside this car because that's been an issue my whole life, is building race cars with roll cages, having a hard time getting in them, feeling too tight in there, hitting my head on the bars. Not cool. With the trans tunnel cut out, the firewall cut out, that brings us up to date in the videos now. So welcome back to the Drift El Camino build. Let's start chopping into this thing some more, make a bit more room for what I need to do next. From here, I figured I needed a lot more room to work around this engine since I'm moving it back so far. And I want room that I can actually work on it when it's all together. I'm gonna make it so that parts come off of it. I can access different parts of the transmission, drive shaft, the yokes or universal joints, whatever I may need to get to. But I need room as much as possible. So pretty much this entire firewall's gotta go. I gotta take the engine and everything back out, make some room to work, and get to cutting. I had previously only cut the floor out enough to get the transmission tunnel out of the way so we could slide the motor and trans into it, see where it might sit, and then make sure that it had enough room. So now I'm gonna cut the rest of the floor pans out because they're mostly rotten and chopped up already as it is. It's not worth keeping them, and for what I have in mind, I'm gonna need a lot of space to make my own floor so I can sit properly in this. I'm pretty tall, I need a lot of room for my head.
Clean it up and I'll be happy. I can put brand new pretty stuff and a brand new over here, just putting everything in kind of loose for the time being, just so I can make.
When the floor pans were gone and I had room to work around that, the next step was getting into the firewall and making that extra wide so I could get the engine to sit inside and it not look completely horrible. As I progress, I'm probably going to cut more into it, but for now I just got to make sure I have room to get in there, everything clears and everything potentially looks good or could look good when I'm done putting it all together.
I'll let the video keep rolling, but this is the moment that I should have realized we're gonna
These were some tricky angles to work on, so if you're going to attempt this, make sure you have the proper guards and everything in place because you don't want your grinding wheel blowing up and smashing your face to bits because you're trying to get it in a weird spot and it twisted funny. Write that down. Getting rid of the upper firewall was a bit of a challenge, but now that it's a big gaping hole and it's all open, it's all been destroyed and ripped apart, I finally have room to move forward and get done what I need to do.
Furniture auctions in California when I was like 8. Yeah, I'd go to like Stater Brothers, I'd buy hot dogs, I'd buy crock pot.
that much room inside, all it was left to do really was measure up everything and start creating a game plan for how I'm going to make it all fit together. Like I said, it's a pretty big motor transmission that's back about 8 inches, so I've got to make sure that the firewall, the transmission tunnel and everything clears the engine properly. I can seal it up so it's safe from fires, that's what it's for, and enough that it keeps the smoke out of the cab so I can see where I'm going when I'm at full drift and blowing a lot of smoke out the back end. And also I wanted to make sure that when it's all together I can easily work on it, because if we're at the track or something like that, I want to be able to get in there and change any part that I might need to change or check anything with a little bit of extra work as possible. So I want to make sure that the firewall is back far enough, it's open enough, the transmission tunnel is big enough that I can get in there when I need, and I have a lot of room for clearance while not making it too weird looking. And I also want to have it so that I can just access parts of it and get to what I need to. So I'm gonna have some probably panels that come off. It's pretty big mock-up plan, pretty big, like I'm not sure how it's gonna work out, but that's the plan for it. So it's about measuring a lot, writing everything down, figuring stuff out, and then just keep moving on forward. The way I'm setting up this El Camino, there's no plans for it, there's no instruction manual. I'm building it as I go, and I'm learning as I go. Not only is the car built in a way that an El Camino is not supposed to be built, I'm putting an engine and transmission combo that didn't come stock in the car, so I have to make everything fit on its own. Not only that, but to get proper weight balance and hopefully get close to the balance of a Corvette, because the suspension is from a C4 Corvette, I've moved the motor back approximately 8.5 inches, give or take. First things first is I had to make some room inside the stock subframe of the C4 Corvette. I should have plenty of room now to get in there and make the motor mounts how I need them to fit. Any kind of shape or any kind of geometry or anything sort of crazy I have to build, I should have room to work around it. Next step up after that is I'm going to take all the accessories off the engine so I can get it in there and make sure it all fits. Like, without the accessories I can get the engine to fit more snug and more proper, and that way also I don't have them all in my way when I'm trying to figure out how my brackets are going to go or how they're going to look. The accessories will sit in front of the block obviously, so that's all completely out of the way from where I'm working, and that'll give me plenty of room just to figure things out. No stress, keep it cool, think slow. The easiest way to figure out where to put holes when making a plate for something like this, which is the motor mount, I'm making the section that goes onto the block itself. So to figure out exactly where those four bolts are gonna sit on the plate, I took a piece of paper, put it on, and did kind of like you would do with a pencil, and over some sort of shape to give it like I rubbed my dirty greasy fingers on it, and it showed me exactly where the 4 holes were gonna be. So I took those holes, that plate I made, that piece of paper, I transferred it over to a metal plate and punched all my holes accordingly. That gave me exactly the bolt hole size I needed, proper spacing, proper measurement, and everything. Easy, done. Put all the metal into the vise, punch your hole, drill a small little pilot hole, and then make your size hole as big as you need, whether you're using drill bits or step bits or anything. Put it in the vise though, and make sure you tighten that sucker down real good, because sometimes with an electric drill or anything, you can catch that metal and send it flying. If you got your hand holding that to a bench or something like that, you might lose a couple digits. At the end of the day, the simplest way that I found was using the drill bit, or using the drill press. Just keep going nice and slow and steady. Spray some oil on that so it doesn't get all jammed up, and bore out the hole to the size you need. After having the plates cut out, all the holes drilled in it to where I needed it, I could test fit it onto the block, make sure it all fits out, make sure it all lines up, make sure it fits good both sides. And then I took the two plates and I put them next to each other, put them in the vise, and did the appropriate trimming on the metal to make sure that it kind of looks uniform and they're about the same size, because I don't want it to look like backyard, don't know what you're doing kind of thing. Even though I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm just learning as I go, but I want it to look nice and proper and professional when it's done. So making sure everything lines up, everything's the same size, everything matches, it's probably a good place to start. Make sure you take the time to deburr all the holes that you just drilled and all the passes that you made with the grinder, because sharp edges and stuff, even if you paint it, it doesn't look good, it doesn't look very professional at all either. You want to smoothen those off. And the other thing is too, when you're handling your steel like that, when it's a fresh cut and there's not deburred, chances are you're going to slice up your fingers real good, and that's not fun either. You end up bleeding all over them, you know what I mean? Basically, this entire process was again repeated for the transmission, which was only 2 bolts, so that was pretty easy. The problem with the transmission, one of those bolts is broken in there and there's a little piece sticking out, so I'm going to have to deal with that later before the final assembly, before everything's put back together. The other half of putting together these motor mounts is the part of the motor mount that's going to sit on the chassis. Now the thing is with this, I kind of wanted to make it so I can remove that also, so that when I take everything apart, I have maximum room to work. And this also makes it a little bit easier when I'm building it, because I have to kind of test fit it a bunch of times over and over again and making sure that everything works out. So having it able to unbolt and come completely out was probably the best. I think it's a good idea. Once again, mostly the same process that I did on the upper motor mounts is the same thing over again. Measure everything out, drill the holes, deburr it, grind it, make sure it fits together, make sure they're the same size, both sides match, it's uniform, it looks good, it looks kind of professional. The difference on this one was welding a nut to the bottom of some of the plates. That would give me the chance to have some sort of fastener that's welded into plates and not have to try to get in there with a wrench or whatever to hold it, because it's obviously in an awkward position underneath the engine, underneath the car, whatever it may be. I just wanted to make it simple, easy to work on. That's the whole idea of this thing. It's going to be a race car built from scratch, so there's going to be a lot of trial, a lot of error. I know it's going to break down all the time. There's going to have a whole bunch of things we're going to have to go through. So the idea here is to make that whole process as simple as possible. So being able to undo the motor mounts from both the engine and the chassis should be all right. I guess that's kind of a factory thing anyway, but I'm just trying to do the best I can to make it as easy as possible. Once all those plates are made, everything is in place. I have a plate mounted to the motor, I have a plate mounted to the chassis, which are both removable for ease of access. It's time to pick the engine and transmission up once again and get that inside of the chassis so that I can figure out exactly how big I have to make those motor mounts, how tall, where it's going to connect, and all the angles and pitches, and make sure everything sits the way I want it to sit to get proper alignment everywhere.
I'm just hoping someone break my fall. Fell off this cloud 9 of mine, ending on tiny shine. But now it's my time to shine, and I'm not the kind of guy you should put aside. I'm the type of guy that's ride or die, just like Bonnie and Clyde. When you live, then I live. 'Cause I give, you took everything I ever had inside, and now my back's against this wall.
It was a little tricky to get this to sit properly. Most of the time I was trying to balance it on a bunch of wooden blocks and make little spacers out of metal that I had used, or leftover pieces I had cut, just to get it to shimmed out the proper way I needed it to. And it was a little tricky doing it, because if I got it to move one way I wanted it to, it would move in another way I wouldn't want it to, like on a different axis. So this was a battle that took longer than anticipated and required a bit more patience than I thought as well. And required a bit more patience than I imagined as well. This entire part of the process was nothing but measuring and moving and knocking things a little bit and making them sit properly, measuring again and measuring and measuring and going over everything, checking every spot, every measurement on it, make sure it was good, square, lined up, straight. It was a battle. So everything's sitting where it needs to be. It's time to start making the rest of the mounts. I started by making plates that would mount the transmission. A little plate that I made that sits on the transmission, it would mount that to the actual transmission mount itself inside the El Camino. Now, the way it sits, I was fortunate enough to be able to use the stock cross member for the transmission mount, welded plates onto it with the new mounting bracket that sits on the transmission. So everything in that department should be perfectly fine and work out good. The way it's built, I can easily space it out if I have to make any kind of other special adjustments or any kind of thing for the pitch of the drive shaft. It's all right there and it should be easily done. The passenger side of the engine was fairly straightforward, fairly simple. I just took a piece of tubing that I had left over from building the roll cage, chopped it down to the appropriate size, the appropriate angle, and it kind of fit right in. I was able to weld it into place on the two plates that are removable, and on the passenger side I now have a complete working, functioning motor mount. Driver's side, however, was kind of a different story because on that side I have to clear the steering column. Because the steering rack is mounted to the subframe, it's sitting inside the El Camino chassis right now. I have a pretty good idea where that's going to pass through. So I was able to take measurements and build something around it. Now my solution was taking that plate sheet metal that I used to build the back half of the chassis for this truck and that I've used for all my mounts so far, was taking that and cutting it into an L shape. Two pieces that I'm going to square off eventually, but for now, I made my two pieces, spaced them out where I needed them to, used the magnet to hold it in straight, and then tack welded it into place. Make sure everything was clean and clear and fit. And since I was pretty confident, or I am pretty confident that's gonna work out, I welded it in a little bit stronger because even though it's just there like to be mocked up and it's not the final weld process yet of it, I've still got to clean it up and make the welds better and stronger, maybe add a few additional pieces into support and box it off like I said. But I want it to be strong enough to be able to hold that engine in place right now, because chances are that it's going to be a couple weeks, a couple months if that motor is sitting there and not moving right now, and it's going to be sitting there so I can make everything else fit and kind of work around that. Now things are going pretty smooth. I have a complete rolling chassis. I changed the front and rear suspensions completely, mounting C4 Corvette suspension into a 71 El Camino chassis. It was by no means an easy task, but I did it. I got it done. The motor and transmission are now sitting inside the car. I made the mounts. I know everything, where it's going to fit, where it's going to sit, and how I'm going to make it all nice and solid and very functional and strong. And the next step for fabrication is going to be my favorite part. I've been anticipating this for a while. We're going to start building the roll cage real soon. I've done a roll cage before, and I honestly understand why guys that have shops that do this, that specialize in this, will charge you so much to do it. It's definitely not an easy task. It's very, very time consuming. There's a lot of math involved, and you can easily make mistakes that end up costing you money. I ordered about 80 feet of piping. It cost me almost $500. If you work it out, that's $5 a foot for the metal. There's a certain thickness, a certain gauge. I got the bigger size pipe. I got 1 3/4 inch. The Formula Drift rules state that that's for a car over a certain weight limit. Seeing that this is an old school El Camino, an A-body chassis, full frame car, an old muscle car, it's probably heavier than a Nissan 240. I went for the bigger diameter pipe of 1 3/4. The other option would have been 1 1/2. It's got a 0.095 thickness on the wall, I believe, and that's regulation for Formula Drift. So I figured if I could follow Formula Drift rules, I could probably be pretty safe just about everywhere I go. Now this truck, this El Camino, this car, whatever you want to call it, this drift monster is probably not going to pass a lot of specs for a lot of competition and stuff like that. It's more of a party car. It's built, designed, put together just to have a good time, just to have fun, and that's the name of the game. But above all, it's got to be safe. So I don't care if it doesn't pass any kind of specs because I have my firewall cut out too much or my motor's moved too far back or whatever else. I just want to make sure that it's going to pass any kind of safety tech so that I could be allowed to race anywhere on any track and feel safe and confident doing it. Given that every foot of mistake you make costs roughly $5, if you're trying to do a big piece and you screw up that bend or you screw up that length of piping, chances are you scrap that whole piece. If you're lucky, you can chop pieces off of whatever you screwed up and use it for later on for little pieces here and there that you might need. But overall, you gotta be pretty careful, not only for your piping, because that's gonna cost you a lot of money when you screw that up, but also if you put it together wrong, like in the pipe bender, for example, if you don't clamp it down properly, you don't tighten it right up, you don't have everything greased and moving like it's supposed to, you could potentially damage your pipe bender as well, which is gonna cost you more money and more time because you're gonna be on the phone calling distributors and people looking for the parts for it. In my case, it's an older bender. It's a cheaper one too, so there's probably not a lot available. So I gotta be really careful in what I do here. Step by step, patience, think it through. Measure 100 times, bend once. Something you have to watch for is the angle of all your bends. Make sure that you're matching them properly, you're getting everything lined up the way you need, and that everything kind of fits together when you're done. It's like a big puzzle and you gotta figure it out. You gotta figure out your distances, your angles, your stretch on your steel, because technically these manual benders, when you're bending a pipe, it sort of stretches it around. So you have to figure out where your bend starts, where it finishes, how much distance it's gonna cover in that bend, how far it's gonna be away from the initial marking of the bend to where it's actually bent to the angle you need, and then how much further that is on the triangular, whatever. It's, you know, so high school would have been a great idea. Should have paid attention a bit more. This maybe would have been a bit easier, but the point is you gotta be really specific on everything and line everything up proper. When bending, I use an angle finder and I check it 100 times before I lock everything in and start bending, because you got to make sure all your bends are kind of uniform. Right now, what I'm doing is the main hoop for the back. That's the bar that goes over top of the back of the seats. Very important. So I got to make sure that all the bends and everything on that work out good. I got the same kind of bend each side. I use the angle finder for this, and you want to make sure that you have it bent from the exact same angle. So you take your angle finder and you're going to measure all the angles. Left, right, forward, backwards, facing you, whatever it is. And then to test it, make sure that I got the bends properly. I lay the metal on the floor and step on it. If it jumps up on one side, or if a bar is up in the air and the other one's not, and I can move it around and it kind of knocks on the ground, that means I would have screwed up. Doing a main hoop is a very important piece of the car. The rule book states that you can't have more than 4 bends. To conform to the inside of most cars, you're going to end up using 4 bends for sure, because you go straight across your roof, then it comes down for where your windows is. Usually it's on an angle, you got a bit of play there, a bit of distance to cover, and then it'll drop straight down from that point. That'll be on the inside of the doors, and you want to get all those angles matching. It can get a little tricky because you got to measure where your bend starts, figure out how far it goes down, and usually there's about an inch of where the clamp goes on to. You have to calculate that all together and make sure you're still fitting inside your measurements. First bend is always straightforward in the bender because you just slide your pipe in, you figure out exactly where your bend's going to start, and you start cranking on it with the angle finder on the pipe at all times to make sure that you know what kind of angle you're at. Now mine sits on the floor, but with it flat on a good level floor, when you bend it, it should be the degrees from the 0, because the bar is straight on the floor and it bends it up. So whatever you get your measurement on your angle finder here should be pretty accurate. There's a little bit of a kickback, and I figured out that it's roughly 6 degrees, sometimes 4, sometimes almost close to 10, depending on, I think, how much you're torquing that thing, how much you're pushing on it. Second bend is a little trickier because you're feeding in a piece that you've already bent, so you got to make sure that the upright angle that you have on it when you start bending the second bend is definitely straight, so that when it comes up, it's all bent kind of square and flat, you know what I mean? So getting back to laying it on the floor, that's to make sure when you put it on the floor that it's completely flat on the floor. That means that you got all your angles properly done. The third and fourth angles, they're a little trickier because not only are you trying to feed this big loop that's already bent into the bender, but you got to make sure you get your other angles on that, trying to figure out where your 0 degree is, where your 90 degree is and stuff. Like, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but hopefully you're getting it visually too, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. And with all that being said, let's say this is the intro to pipe bending. There's so much to go over. There's a lot of stuff to talk about, and this video is primarily about building the El Camino. So maybe I'll do a second video somewhere, another video somewhere else of how to bend pipes and how to set up your pipe bender, how to figure out your angles and your measurements using the one that I use, because, well, maybe not everybody's got one, but maybe not everybody's got the big expensive ones either. So one day I'll upgrade, but until then, we'll work with what we got. We'll figure it out. And with all that being said, by the time that this was all figured out and all done and everything, I test fitted it, and no go, baby. Wasn't good. I ended up not measuring a certain part on the inside. I ended up mismeasuring on the inside of the pipe across the ceiling. I thought that I had more clearance inside the cab of this truck, but I really didn't. And then I ended up with having 2 inches too much, and it would not sit inside the cab properly. So basically, this whole piece, this whole instruction, everything, that it didn't work out. But like I said before, measure 100 times and bend once. And I got a little too excited, I guess, and I didn't take my own advice. So now we get to start from fresh. It's always better the second time around, right? So second go at it, I'm down about 16 feet. Gives me roughly 64 feet left to play with. No problem for now, but it'll bite me in the ass later. Starting fresh now with another set of pipes. I make sure that I get my measurements down pat. Now, there's 2 different bending points on each side, so I measure from the center out. I measure where my first bend is going to be. I calculate how much that bend is going to have with the stretch in it, with the curve, figure out where it's going to land, and then I can measure my second bend point from there. So everything's measured out before the pipe even hits the inside of the pipe bender. First step is to do the most aggressive bends, because those are always the toughest to get exactly accurate both sides. With the angle finder on the side of the pipe, it gives me a chance to watch it go up nice and slow, calculating again for the spring back. So I keep the angle finder on it, let off the slack a bit when I'm done bending, and see where it lands. If it's a little short, while it's still plugged in, while it's still hooked up and bolted all together, everything remains solid, I still have a chance at giving it a little bit more of a bend to get a little bit more angle than I need. This time around, I'm taking extra care to perfectly measure out all the markings of where my bends are going to begin. That way I can figure out where the end and the next one's going to start. So putting it all back inside with most of the bends done, I'm getting the third and fourth bends done now. I had to make sure that the clamp was good and tight on the bender, make sure that everything is snug, nothing's moving. Go around with the angle finder, check all the angles, left to right, forward to back, up and down. At this point, when all the bends are done, it has to make a complete 180, so that I'm gonna have a 0 degree and 90 degree on each side, or it'll be easier to measure when it's all done, but you know you're on the right path when it's all measuring out square. Getting all that done, I noticed that when I put it on the floor to measure it with my markings, I actually bent a little further than I was supposed to, and it's got a tighter angle than it should, making the floor bars closer to each other than they should be. So I'm gonna have to find a solution for this, but because it's a roll cage and I'm gonna have to have many braces inside of it to make sure it's good and strong and safe, that's not gonna be a problem because I have many options to play with here. Solving the problem of having these two posts that sit on the floor too close to each other was not a big deal at all. I simply screwed in a piece of 2x4 into the bottom of the shelf, the pad that I have across the floor, and I used the corners of that to keep the cage stretched out far enough like it should be, make sure I had the proper distance in it. That way it stayed there, it stayed down nice and snug, while I was able to cut out another piece which was going to be a lower crossbar for the main hoop anyway. So I cut that out, I notched the piping by simply using a grinder and a couple measuring things just to get what they call the throat line. Grinding that out with the grinder, and it gets you really close to sitting and onto the pipe as if you use the notcher. So maybe I'll do a video to show you guys that, but if not, there's other videos online on YouTube you can check out and figure all that out. But if there's somebody that wants to see that, throw it in the comments and I'll give you a quick rundown how I do it. Once it was all down there, I welded it in together, make sure it's gonna stay, and then it was time to test fit inside the car. Finally, this time, a victory. The main hoop is now in the car, it fits, the crossbar is in it, holding it at the proper measurements. It looks great. The only thing I had to do now was cut up the sides of it a little bit, because to clear where the doors sit, I'm gonna have to take a couple chunks of metal out of it, and at the same time it gives me a chance to clean up the inside of the cab where the piping is gonna be, so that I can have gussets that actually go from the roll cage tubing to the chassis of the car. Stiffening everything up, and if I do it right, it'll look pretty good. It'll be much safer, much more solid. The idea of make this thing one big solid triangle so that it'll take any kind of hit and I can be safe inside along with my passenger. So let's end this one while it's good, because I'm gonna start chopping up the pipe for the halo loop. That's the loop that goes above your head, and it's getting a little tough to do this on my own, to hold all the piping in place and get everything lined up and hold it and tack it and weld it and check it and measure it. So I'm calling in AJ next week. He's gonna come here and he's gonna help me finish putting in the roll cage of this car. This week we take another chunk out of that roll cage, get things working better, get things in together, get things all coming together nicely. So far, this cage work has turned out to be quite the task. Now that I've done the main hoop, the next step is to do the halo on top. Now it's going to be pretty tricky because I have to get 4 bends in that one as well to match the inside of the ceiling of the El Camino, and I'm going to have to hold it up and have it lined up perfectly in position while I tack it in and weld it in with nothing really to support it. So I called in the big guns. I've got my kid brother AJ helping me out. He's not really trained in the arts of building cars, but he's a quick learner, he's a smart kid, and he always catches all the stuff that I miss. So 2 heads are better than 1. It's always good to have a second opinion, second set of eyes, because, you know, sometimes you can be real confident about what you're doing, but it doesn't always work out. It's always nice to have a helping hand too. Getting started doing the bends on the halo, it's very similar to doing the bends on the main hoop. You gotta start from the center and then work your way out. Get all your bends, figure out where they're gonna be, figure out where your angles are. In the end, it's gotta come out right next to each other, so like basically a whole 180 bend, and it's gotta line up properly onto your main hoop. Pretty tricky, but with AJ there, he was able to check the angles, check the angle finder every time I moved something, or every time I tightened something up, or every time I started bending, so that a second set of eyes was always on it to make sure that it was bent out straight. Laid it on the floor, it was flat. That means all the bends are in angle too. All the bends are in line too.
So it's been a pretty dense couple weeks of mini truck content. We've been having a blast.
Oh yeah, mini trucks are sick.
You damn right they are.
To test fit the halo bar, you have to get it up inside the cab. It's got to be above the windshield, above your windows. It's got to line the inside of the ceiling and make its way to the main hoop in the back. So having 2 pairs of hands on this one was definitely a good deal. Trying to do it alone would be kind of a pain in the ass. I've done it before with a whole bunch of straps and contraptions and everything kind of holding it up. I put some of that theory in here too to make sure it kind of stayed where we needed to with minimal effort. But having AJ there to hold it all nice and tight and figure out exactly where I'm going to have to cut was definitely a key part of this project. After all the angles were figured out and everything sat where it had to be, it was just as simple as marking it and then taking the grinder and cutting it. Then again, to get the right angles to sit onto the other tubing, because I don't have a pipe notcher, I have to use a technique called cutting the throat line. Now there's a way to measure it and figure it out and get your proper angle for where your pipe's gonna sit against your other pipe, even if it's not on a 90 degree, even if it's different angles, there's a way to do it. So we threw it up on the bench, I did all the measurements I needed to, cut the lines out, and then it was time to test fit again to see if we got the right measurements and the right cuts. We cut, bent, trimmed, test fitted a bunch of times to make sure it was all going to work out. Then I tacked it in place, leaving the toe straps kind of sitting on it that way that it sort of all stays together, nice and tight, nice and solid. Now the next move now is we're going to have to do the A-pillars. The A-pillars run from the top of the halo in front of you down to the floorboards. Because this is all completely open, there's no dash in it, I can go as far as I want in, and I want it to kind of follow the natural A-pillars in it, follow the line of the windshield a little bit, and that way it's all tucked away nice inside, very far ahead, giving me more room, more protection, and also what I think is a better look. So to get this done properly and make sure that we had room to work, because I hate working in tight spots, we took the doors right off the car. Probably something I should have done a long time ago, but now they're off, they're out of the way, we got room to weld everything in. To make these A-pillars sit up as far forward as I needed to, I had to take a couple of chunks of metal out of underneath the windshield, as well as alongside of the inside of the door. It's kind of just stuff that was sheet metal, kind of holding everything together. I'm sure part of it was structural, but now with the cage going in it, the cage is actually going to be the main structure of the car. The cage will be solid to the chassis, to the frame. It's going to be solid and welded to the body. The cage will hold everything, and the cage will be the main support of the entire chassis. Realistically, in the end, it's all going to become one, and everything's going to be welded together. The frame to the roll cage, to the body, to the cage, to the frame. Nothing's going to come off this thing, but it's kind of like a unibody car, like the new cars we have now. It's all one solid piece, really. If you got to do anything to it, you just cut a hole in it and work around it. Now that we're to the point of cutting the A-pillars and figuring out where they're going to fit and how they're going to sit, we got to get the bends, the angles. I wish I could say at this point that making the cage becomes easier, but it's constantly a game of finding the right angles, the right measurements, figure out where that angle's going to land when the stretch is done, when the bend is done, because it's going to kind of change your measurements up a little bit. Then you've got to make sure you get it on the floor proper and nice and straight. You've also got to take into account that the pipes are going to fit together somehow, and you're going to have to cut a groove into the pipe to fit it there. A lot of it you can get away with doing the throat line technique that I've been talking about, but some of it is just pretty tough. Overall, the ideal thing would be to have a notcher, but I don't have that luxury. So a lot of the grinding and stuff is going to take a lot of fine timing and take patience and a lot of little caresses with the grinder to make sure everything's going to fit properly. Now this will take hours and hours and hours, so I didn't film all of it going crazy and stuff like that, but hey, you got to put in the work. Once the B-pillars were all figured out, the bends were proper and it was fitting into place nicely, it was kind of easy to do the other one because the main hoop and the halo hoop were bent properly and correctly, and everything was squared and everything lined up and everything fell right on its mark, that it was almost as simple as copy and paste, just repeating the same procedure over exactly for the driver's side and the passenger side A-pillars. After that, I decided to put a dash bar right across. Should stiffen up the two bars, make sure they sit solid, and it gives me something to mount my steering rack to, or my steering column, a bunch of other accessories and stuff I might need inside the car, as well as holding up the dash and adding a little bit of extra security for a side impact. That way there's strength inside of it instead of the chopped out firewall that I've created in this car. And then again, this whole roll cage and everything is going to fit inside and it's going to hold the chassis together. It's going to be the main structural point. So it's very important that I get every angle covered. After the dash bar was in and it fit nicely, another part that I have to do was a crossbar from the top to the bottom corner of the main hoop. Now this crossbar has to go from the back of my head to the other corner beside the driver's seat, and that gives it a bit more strength in case of a rollover. Remember, triangles are like the most strong shape you can create, so putting that in triangulates the entire thing, and it makes it good and solid, so I won't get any kind of weird movement in case of a high impact or rollover. Like I said, I bent the back of this cross pipe a little bit that it would stick out towards the rear of the truck, and that way it gives me a little bit of extra room to clear my helmet, because like I've mentioned previously, I'm 6'2", so getting into a race car for me has always been a problem. I've always seemed to have small cars, and then when you put a cage in there and add a helmet, it lowers your room drastically. So with this one, I want to make sure I have room to move around and I'm comfortable and I'm safe, and above all, I don't knock my head around all the time on the cage, because that's annoying when you get headache by the time you're done and it's just bad and it's not safe, and you get what I'm getting at. So I made the cross piece, welded that in solid, and then after that it was just to basically go through everything that I had done to this point and just make sure all the welds are good. I had been tack welding up until now in case there was any sort of mistake anywhere. It'd be easy to take stuff off, but now that everything's fitting in, all the measurements are landing where they're supposed to be exactly, and it's perfect from side to side, I can weld it all up solid. And I would say at this point, it's definitely gratifying doing these kind of welds, because when you're in there and you got the helmet on and everything's working out nicely, you get a good heat going, you can carry your welds nicely, nice and smooth. It's sort of a reward for all the fitting and all the time that you put into grinding and trying to notch stuff, doing the cutthroat lines and trying to make everything fit properly. Once you get it all lined up, everything fitting, you can weld it in solid. And welding is sort of like an art. If you guys have been following the channel, I'm into art and I like that kind of stuff. So once you get a good flow going, it's really kind of relaxing actually. I could probably weld for hours and hours, and I have with this. It took a long time to get that all through. I mean, you guys might not realize it, but in these videos that you're watching that are 10 or 15 minutes long, that's often 2 days of work that went into the car, plus a day of editing, and plus filming this part, talking to you guys and everything. It's a whole lot of work in the end, but it's definitely fun and I enjoy doing it, and it's what I do. So I hope you guys are enjoying it too. Getting around to every angle on this roll cage and making sure I'm underneath it and around the sides and everywhere that I probably wouldn't think of or wouldn't see. Double check with AJ there as always. He's using the camera, so we're running around and he's looking at stuff as I'm working on stuff and making sure I don't miss anything. All in all, it was a great day. I got the main structure of this cage done. It's looking good so far. I fit in it. I'm gonna test fit it with a seat later, but up until now, I'm very happy with what's going on. The roll cage was definitely something I look forward to, and it was a lot of fun, and it's tricky, and I did make a couple mistakes, and we are actually running out of piping now, so I'm gonna have to get some of that ordered before I keep moving on forward, but it's going good. You gotta stick to the plan, keep it going through this. We gotta finish this car. This is the one that's gotta be done. Cage near completion, or at least a pretty good idea where I'm going with it and where it's going to sit. Now I can jump into working on the floors, which is going to prove to be a pretty tedious job because of how it's been so far and what they look like and what I have to do to seal this sucker up. Because the thing is, building the floor, I'm going to have to also build, which is basically a rear firewall. And of course, I want to seal off the driver's cabin of this vehicle, because as soon as I start rolling smoke off those back tires and drift, it's gonna fill up real quick, make it hard to breathe, make it hard to see, and I just don't feel like dealing with that. I want the air to flow through this thing, and I want no obstructions. I want to be able to see what I'm doing. Because this El Camino, unfortunately, apparently, obviously, sat in a mud puddle for a couple years, the chassis and everything is pretty rusted. Now, I'm lucky enough that there's no holes or major structure issues with the frame at all. It's pretty solid, but it has a nice coating of rust on it. So before I start welding up pipes and tubing and a bunch of chunks of metal to it, I gotta clean it off and make sure that it's real good so I can get a good contact and make sure that the weld just penetrates right through both ends of the metal and everything is gonna be strong, solid, and good. All cleaned up, gotta lay down some measurements. So I get in there with the tape measure and start figuring out exactly how wide I need these things from frame rail to frame rail and how I'm gonna structure it. It's gotta hold the transmission tunnel, it's gotta hold up the floor, and it's gotta hold up a set of race seats. So you want that to be really solid, and I think I'm gonna probably work the flooring into the caging, making, again, the whole El Camino, everything, the car, this truck, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be one solid piece at the end. This is a vehicle where the frame could separate from the body. You could lift the body off of it, do some work to it, pull all the frame apart, just be left with a bare chassis. But now, it's more like your standard unibody car where it's going to be all one piece, all welded tight together. So I have to make sure I get the right measurements and I build something here that's going to be strong enough. Ultimately, the flooring is going to be squared off because it's a good square section to work with, and it's going to be a very, very simple design. So, being as it's going to be a very simple design, the floor parts are very simple to make. Measure them out, cut them out, tack them in. It can be easier than that. Key point here is making sure that I weld both ends of the tube at the exact same spot on the frame so that when you're looking at it from the side or measuring it, it goes straight 90 degrees crossing that chassis, and it's going to give me a good structure to build off of. I'm going to have to run two down alongside of it. That's going to hold my transmission tunnel. That's going to be the opposite side of the seat rail. Since one seat rail, these sparkles are pretty big, one seat rail is actually going to sit on the chassis. The other one, well, I had to make something there in its place. So I decided to put two pieces of tubing, make it all uniform, make it all match. It's the same size as the cage so that when I tie it in, it's all going to look good together and it's all going to be structurally the same size, which should prove to be beneficial. So all I really had to do now was make sure I got the right measurements, use the throat line technique, and cut out the chunks of metal where I needed. Skips me having to use a pipe notcher, and also it gives me a little bit of freedom, so if I want to move stuff a little bit, I can always grind a little bit extra out, have a bit more clearance, but you gotta make sure you're pretty on point or else it won't work out. I've had multiple problems, but that's because of the way that my vise was at this current time, flopping around. It was really nonsense. I should have done something about it earlier, but if you... The next step, making sure all the pipes fit in properly. That's kind of a sketchy part because it's easy to let your eyes play tricks on you, and in fact they actually did at this spot. I ended up welding on the wrong side of the marking, but that's besides the point. We won't get into that. Now after I had the cross beams in the way I wanted them, the tubing fit nicely. The bars that run parallel with the frame, I fit those in as best as I could, made sure all the measurements were good, and tacked them in where I need them. Now you might notice that one of these is a little bit off of the other one. I measured it out and I pushed it over the same size as that tubing on one side to move it over because I have an intention to make a trans tunnel that comes off, and I'm gonna make some sort of latching system, and I might need that a little bit of extra room for an idea. I have to clip it down to bolt it down. We're gonna try to get some maybe rib nuts or something like that to be able to do this, but I have to kind of plan ahead, and it looked kind of weird and it looks off balance because of this, but you're gonna see how it works out in the end because the drive shaft could potentially be pretty big also, and I'm gonna need a little bit extra room in there. The way the floor is designed, there's gonna be a bar running underneath the drive shaft, and then it's gonna fit inside the tunnel, so it's got its own kind of tunnel thing, and the drive shaft does not sit any lower than the chassis at all. Everything actually sits a little bit higher because of how much lower I'm making this vehicle. The suspension in the back is sitting up way high so that the drive shaft's going to sit high, and in turn I brought the motor up so I can clear the oil pan so the frame and the body of the car can sit way low. Now I'm kind of winging it a little bit. I have a plan, but it's not a very solid plan, because if you guys have been following this, you know I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just learning as I go, and I'm not making it up, but I'm getting an education on the fly. And so everything might not work out, but I believe it will. So the next task is going to be to take the seat off the shelf and throw it inside the El Camino, see how it fits, make sure everything lines up. Now this is a really big Sparco bucket seat. This is the Evo 3, which is, I believe, one of the biggest Sparco seats you can get. And it's pretty wide on the inside. The bottom of the bucket is at least 18 inches wide. So that actually causes me a couple problems, because even though the El Camino is a big car, it's an A-body chassis like a Chevelle or whatnot, it still gives me a little bit of issue with the way the transmission tunnel is going to sit so high. The way the thing is positioned and the way the truck's been slammed on the ground with everything elevated to get the frame and the chassis lower, it's going to give me a trans tunnel that's almost the equivalent of an armrest. It's going to sit pretty high. So to get the seats to fit in properly between the doors when they're shut and the trans tunnel and underneath that cage is maybe going to be a little bit of a challenge. Now it's the Evo 3, it's the biggest one. I slide around in there a lot. Even the Evo 2 is a little bit big for me, honestly. But I have an Evo 2 for my driver's seat. That's the one that's in the RX-7 right now. I'm very comfortable with it. I know it. I like it. It feels good. It's my ass is imprinted in that seat after so many miles, so it's comfy. It's comfy. It's part of me. And that's going to be my driver's seat. And the Evo 3 is going to be the passenger seat. And the Evo 3, not only did I get a very, very good price, and that's why I bought it, because I guess not a lot of dudes are going to run this seat, but I've got an extra big seat so that, because I got some friends that are big, so if I could give them rides in the car and they're good and they're comfy and they're safe, which is most important. If you don't fit in the race seat properly and you're trying to strap yourself in all cattywampus and stuff like that, that's a lot of danger that could potentially happen. So I got to keep the homies safe. I got this big Evo 3. We're going to put 4-point harnesses both sides, and I'll just bring some extra cushions for the littler dudes or little dudettes that want to go for a rip in the car, and that way they can fit nice and snug inside, and everybody's going to be safe, comfortable, happy, and going 150 miles an hour sideways. My next move was to make some sort of mounting plate that I could put the seats on. So my initial idea was to cut out these big slabs out of the sheet metal that AJ got me for doing all the other fabrication. Now it's thick enough that I could definitely make seat mounts out of it. I could definitely mount a seat to it, especially if it's welded to the chassis the way it's going to be. I'm obviously going to put some more structure underneath it when it's complete, but for now I just want to tack it in so that I can line up the seat and test it out and see where it's going to be, because even though it's a big car and I'm a big dude and I got lots of room in there anyway, it's still going to come out pretty tight. I was doing some measurements on my floor and where the pedals will sit, and I'm a little concerned, to be honest with you, so I gotta test fit everything and make sure everything sits. I gotta put that seat far back as I can into the roll cage, and that's why I purposely built the X bar in the roll cage. The cross diagonal is actually bent so it sticks out further. I'm gonna do the same thing for my harness bar so I can mount up my 4-point harnesses to it. That's gonna sit back a little bit more too, so I can get the maximum distance out of this seat. Now another thing I'm gonna do to this seat to make sure that I fit proper and better is something that I haven't done before, and that's adjust the seating position to a proper spot. Now I'm a tall guy, so most cars that I sit in, I'm really into like small Japanese cars. My RX-7 is very small. I have a hard time fitting in it. I'm 6'2". I lean the seat way back in that car. Now the brackets are set like as far back as they can be, and actually the RX-7 I made custom mounts so that I could have the seat lean back to the pitch that I need. But a big problem with this is that I'm often sitting way too far back. I'm stretched out, reaching the steering wheel. The RX-7 has a deep dish and a spacer, so it's okay. But for a race car application, I want to sit in a proper position. Not only is leaning back potentially more dangerous, but if I can sit in the proper place, in the proper position, I can sit more forward, more straight up. It'll give me better vision and it'll give me more safety. I can sit in the car properly, see what I'm doing, and then not have to worry so much about all the little things because it's all going to be right there in front of me. And also too, potentially I can reach the dash to start the vehicle. After getting these sheets cut out that I'm going to use for seat mounts out of this massive plate, I put them in the vehicle, tacked them in to make sure that they don't move too much on me, and then I can put a little bit of weight on it, and then I retest fit the seat again. There's a lot of testing and taking stuff out, putting it back in, testing it, and over again. So this is a process that I'm going to have to go through, but it's going to be worth it in the end because I absolutely want to make sure that I fit and that I'm comfortable with this vehicle, because I don't want any excuse that deters me from driving it. Even if it wasn't that comfortable, I'd still drive the crap out of it as much as I can. But the idea, I want to make it the best it could possibly be. And also too, that my friends can drive it. I want the homies to take it out, take it for a rip, because potentially, like, I wanted them to come down here and work on it and learn a bunch of new techniques and stuff with me. And the same goes for driving. When it's done, we're going to take it to the racetrack, and everybody that helped me work on it will get thrown the keys and they can totally take it for a rip. That's the beauty of this project. It's not a super high-end muscle car. It's a classic car, and some people really like them, and some people might be upset that I'm doing this to this car, but at the end of the day, it's going to be super awesome. And not a lot of people have done this. And the thing is, it was a really rough car anyway, and like I'd mentioned previously, I'd sold my 240 for roughly $2,500. It was a rolling chassis with fenders and nice stuff on it. And the El Camino I picked up for roughly the same price. I paid a little bit more for the El Camino chassis, but it is what it is. Kind of hard to find too, so it's kind of cool. And all my life I've dreamt of building an El Camino as a race car, because my first car was an El Camino, my dad's first car was an El Camino, and I think that's a lot of awesome heritage, so I want to keep that spirit alive, and this is where we're going. Now I have my cage fabricated to the point where I can see where everything is going, and I know where it's going to land and where it's going to end up. I got the seat positioned in the car, I test fit it, I sat inside of it a few times, make sure I have enough room for my head with the helmet on, clearing the cage, I have enough room for my arms to move, and there's enough leg room in it, because this is kind of like a pickup truck. It's sort of like a cab. It's not necessarily like a car where you can take out the back seats and sit where the back seats were if I needed to. This is a truck, basically, car kind of deal. So I have to make sure I got leg room because I need to be able to function the pedals. I don't want my knees hitting the steering wheel. That's a major pet peeve of mine. But at the same time, I have to make sure that I sit close enough to the dash to be able to operate things that I need to get at. I'm potentially going to run this vehicle with an electric water pump, electric fuel pumps. It's going to have the fan switches. I'm going to have a bunch of stuff hooked up on toggle switches that I can use when I need to. And I want to be able to reach that. I want to be able to start the car no problem without having to undo my harness. And another thing too that it's often overlooked, or I've overlooked in the past, is that when you have a harness on, your shoulders are pressed up against the seat, you're in there tight. It does make it hard to reach for things. One of those things is the door. So I'm gonna have to set up some kind of strap that's attached to the door that I could pull. But then again, because this is an El Camino and it's basically truck, car, it's got really short doors. So the chances are when the door is completely open, I can still reach it because it's not going to be that long. It won't be a long door like a 240 or even a Camaro or a Trans Am or anything like that. A big piece of making this thing strong is building triangles into it. Now, triangle is apparently one of the strongest shapes you can build. So as I'm building the roll cage and setting everything up and hooking it up to the chassis, I'm making sure to triangulate as much as I possibly can. So with this idea in mind, I started fabbing some pipes that would go from the back of the roll cage to the kick-ups on the frame, which would create a triangle from where the frame kicks up to go over the rear differential and connecting directly into the frame with the 1 3/4 inch piping. It's the same exact piping size that I used for the rest of the cage, so it's going to keep everything a constant size, and hopefully that's going to make everything good and strong because all the pipes are going to fit together properly and hold each other very well. I had to cut the firewall out of the rear that was in their stock to be able to put these pipes through. I still have to build that transmission tunnel, and I have to put a whole bunch of extra supports in it. My drive shaft is going to be coming through there. I'm eventually going to have to build a whole bracing system for that differential, because if you've been following, you saw before, I just used tempo piping just to temporarily hold it up in place at the right angle so that I can get the chassis on the ground and I can measure everything else, and I can continue with the fabrication of everything else that I have to do to this. I still have a long list ahead of me, but I'm looking forward to it. Once the firewall is completely cut out, now I have a little bit of room to work, so I can get to measuring out the piping that I'm going to need to go from the cage to the kickups on the chassis. Then I got to work on cutting those out, measured them out on the bench, and did the throat cut line again. That way I could get the piping on the cage to fit properly. The other end was just going to be a simple angle, but I had to make sure I got the right one. So what I did was I did the pipe, the notching of the pipe with the throat angle with the grinder, and then put it in place, compared it to where it was going to sit on the frame, and I was able to draw a line straight off the frame because it's the straightest part of the whole vehicle. It's the piece that I made, and it was a straight piece of steel going straight up. So I got the proper angle. I just had to make sure that I had it sitting level, so that I measured from the same points on the chassis itself. It sits dead center, both at the same height, and it's level from the back of the frame to the cage. So aesthetically, it's going to look good as it will function. I'm gonna have to do a lot of work to this floor that I'm probably not even gonna put on film because it's a lot of tedious stuff. The back firewall of the El Camino has this crazy curve in it. So to make that work with the design that I have in mind, everything I've done so far with the roll cage, I'm gonna pretty much make that straight up and down. So I have to box off each end of that inside the box. I have to make sure that it's gonna make a nice seam and it's not gonna leak in any smoke from it. So there's a lot of little tedious things that you probably won't see on the film, but it's starting to come together. It's starting to look strong, and I really need to get this floor and the rear firewall done and sealed up with the cross piping and stuff in it that I need, so that I can move on to making my differential brackets. I'm gonna make a nice X bracket, probably using a lot of this piping, something that's good and strong and that's gonna be completely adjustable, so I can adjust it as I need to, because I'm sure I'm gonna have to do tons of adjustment on this truck. We're gonna have to take it, we're gonna have to shake it down, we're gonna have to test it, we're gonna have to run it like crazy and figure out everything that's wrong with it before we can like legitimately go to a track day and just have a good time. At the end of the day, I want this thing to run solid for hours and hours so we can have hours and hours of fun. So basically there's a long road ahead. But at this point, I finally have some direction of where I'm going with the floor and what I'm gonna do. My plan is set, I've got it in my head. The only thing left is to put it together. So it's starting to look pretty strong now. I can't wait to do more. So this is the part of the project that gets long, it gets tiresome, it gets tedious, and to be completely honest with you, I'm not really feeling it. The next step is all a bunch of little things that have to come together to make one thing function properly, and that's making the back firewall in this thing, modifying it from its original position, making sure all the tubes that I recently put through it are gonna fit properly, and everything lines up, everything is sealed, keeps me safe, keeps the truck solid, and still maintains a good look. A huge part of this project requires redesigning, rebuilding, reconstructing a lot of parts of this vehicle. So something I didn't really plan out too much was this part of the build. I'm kind of going with it and figuring it out as I go. But right now, the biggest issue, the biggest thing in my way is chunks of the body that have been left over from what I cut, jagged edges, protruding parts. There's a bunch of pieces that are in my way. They're old, they're rusty, they're sharp, they're not conformed at all, they're all in the wrong ways, they're all ugly, and I need to get past that to do what I have to do next. So in order to have the job done well, have enough room to work, I had to cut these out with the grinder. It was a really tough to get to spot, so it proved to be a pretty big challenge. And then since I was in there, I took the wire brush to it and started cleaning it out, because there's nothing worse than trying to work around a dirty, nasty, rusty surface and then trying to weld to it. Never turns out good. If your metal's not clean when you weld, it's gonna spatter, it's gonna make holes, it's gonna make a real mess, it's gonna stink, it's gonna be terrible. So the best thing is to make sure everything is clean and clear, so you have room to work, you're safe, and everything turns out solid and good and conform, and then you're satisfied after. Cleaning up your work and making new spots to work and opening up areas to look at and to figure things out in always proves to be a good thing, because you see things that you didn't see before. A perfect example is going to be parts of the frame that I could have welded more solid. I added extra pieces of metal to stiffen everything up and got in there with the welder and made sure I got it good and hot so that the pieces that I added to the frame would be completely connected to the new frame. All the metal molecules melted in there together and it's more solid than it was stock. And importantly, I needed to weld the cage to the frame to the body and make everything in this vehicle, make everything in this ride become one. It's got to be a solid, strong piece, so when I take it out on the track and make it do what it's supposed to do, that it performs properly and it doesn't bend and twist and shake apart on me. Part of the structure that I planned to do to connect the roll cage to the actual chassis of the car was to put these pipes in between the kick-ups on the frame where it goes up over the rear differential to the back of the roll cage that I have put inside the cab of the car. Since I'm working in the bottom of the cab right now, everything is open and clear. There's nothing in my way. It's a perfect time to put these through. I'm gonna have to plan out something that I can put sheet metal around it and have it look good and have it be solid. But right now, I'm gonna get these pipes through there, measure them up, make sure they're the right length, do the throw line cuts on it so it fits on the roll cage nicely. And then on the back where the kick-ups are, quite simply put, I can put the pipe next to the chassis and use the line of the chassis to draw a straight line. It's gonna come out clean and clear, it's gonna look great. I made sure both sides were exact same length, exact same dimensions, everything fit properly. It was in the same position on the kick-up as it was on the roll cage, so everything was centered. When it looked good, I tacked it together, take another look, make sure everything's good, double measure, and then weld it in solid when you know you got the right thing going on. Now that I'm running these pipes through from the cage to the kick-ups before I put the sheet metal in, I can't drill holes through the sheet metal inside the piping in because now it's in there and it's permanent. So what I'm gonna have to do is make some sort of brace, some sort of metal that travels up to the tube and something I can anchor my sheet metal to from both sides. That way I have a solid piece to mount to, and if I would ever have to take off some panels, I don't have to remove the entire rear panel or cut the pieces that have the pipes through it. I can just remove the individual panels by hopefully just grinding off the welds, or worst case, if I have to, we'll take the plasma cutter to it and call it a day. To get this done, my plan is to take a piece of sheet metal, the stuff that I used for most of the fabrication for it, the big sheet that I have, and I'm gonna drill 2 holes through it. Then I'm gonna cut those out as rectangle pieces with the hole in the center, cut that center piece of the hole, which gives me the opportunity to put it into the cage, into the chassis of the truck. It'll be part of the rear firewall, so one piece will be on top, one piece will be on the bottom. When they're both connected, it'll completely surround the tube. I could weld it on, weld it together, weld those tabs to the firewall and floor of the El Camino, and then sheet metal the rest of it around the sides. Everything should be good, everything should be solid. I think it's gonna be good. After punching it, drilling pilot holes, make sure everything was lined up, everything was straight, it was time to pull out the hole saw. Now, I haven't used this for a while, I don't know what kind of good shape it's in, so I had to find the proper size and then I had to set it all up. Put it in the drill press, make sure it was locked down, everything was good and solid. Now this is gonna grab the metal pretty tough, so you wanna make sure that your chuck key is perfectly tightened. You wanna do one of every hole in there, go around all 3 spots, make sure it's good and level, kind of like when you torque your wheels. And then you got to make sure that the drill bit is good, it's straight, and that it's going to go through. And in my case, well, the drill bit is broken and I do not have a replacement. So I had to do the best that I could. What I did was I pre-drilled the hole to the proper size for the drill bit that comes in the hole saw, and then put it down in the vise, put it down on the drill press, and went to town. Now to make sure it didn't move too much, I used a really big clamp, and then I also used some wooden blocks underneath it so that the drill had somewhere to go while the hole saw was working, and that when I did actually get through it, I didn't put the hole saw directly into the bottom of the drill press, which is very hard steel and would definitely destroy that hole saw. So the pieces of wood added like an extra cushion, and it gave me a bit of grip and a bit more traction to get what I had to do. The main issue here though is that you have to go super slow. It grabs, it'll stop the drill press, which is probably a good thing because it stops it from spinning around and breaking my fingers or breaking something inside the drill press. So you got to go very gentle. I use WD-40 to keep everything moving smoothly. You'd think almost it wouldn't grab, but it does. It works great. You can hear it. You spray it on, things get hot. The WD-40 not only lubricates your metal when you're trying to cut it, makes it easier to spin the blade, but it also keeps it cool, and that keeps it from breaking. Once the holes were drilled and everything looked pretty satisfactory, I test fitted it, make sure that I could slide a pipe through there, and lo and behold, it went through without a problem. It was a perfectly snug fit, so I guess the measurements on the saw were correct. So after that was done, the holes were good, everything passes through, everything clears. The next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna chop it right down in half through the center of the holes. Now the thing is, I should have done it long ways first because it would have made a more uniform connection when I put it together, and I should have used some sort of technique to make sure that those lines were much straighter, because I got it all chopped out, made this one piece with 2 holes into it into 4 pieces so that I can cover both sides of the job that I'm doing. If you're following, you know what I'm saying? Even I'm lost, it's okay. So I cut it all out, and then all that's left now is basically put it in the chassis. Now I should have taken my time a little bit more on this, but this is like one of those weird things where I wasn't feeling it and I was kind of getting down on it, and I kept moving and I kept going. Maybe I should have took a little break from it, but I didn't. But now that I see how it kind of turned out, I'm a little disappointed, but I promise I'll make up for it more in the near future. It was just a minor thing where it's time to move on to the next thing.